next. So we ask in advance for understanding when words may be incorrect on the screen. Now, we have 3 speakers this evening. We really wanted to show you a variety of issues that people face and wildlife faces, both here in Minnesota and around the world, for 3 beloved species that we have here at the Minnesota Zoo. So prairie dogs, wolves, and tigers. And I think it's going to be really interesting to hear and compare and contrast between those 3 species and the people that work on them. And so I'd like to introduce our speakers this evening. So we'll start with Dan Stark, who is the large carnivore specialist for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources, Division of Fish and Wildlife. He works as the state's wolf specialist in overseeing the transition of wolf management from the federal government to the DNR, and implementing the state wolf management plan. Dan also works on bear season and policy issues for the DNR. He's a Minnesota native and grew up in central Minnesota. He has a bachelor's degree in biology from St. Cloud State University and completed graduate work at the University of Arizona. He lives with his family in Grand Rapids. Next we have Bill Seyfried, who grew up in Plymouth, Minnesota, and attended Carleton College, Northern Michigan University, and the University of Minnesota. He's currently a postdoctoral associate at the University of Minnesota, researching deer winter habitat use and moose calving phenology. Bill has also been involved in research on moose calf survival, cause-specific mortality, and their subsequent effects on populations here in Minnesota, as well as beaver foraging ecology in Michigan's Upper Peninsula and Voyageurs National Park, as well as what he'll talk about this evening, prairie dogs and ferrets in Montana. Thanks, Bill. And then we also have Narayan Dakal, did I say your name correctly? Thank you. Who graduated from the University of Minnesota, trained in the complexity of ecological processes involving human communities, and is a native Nepali researcher with perspective on human dimensions of natural resource management. His interest is to integrate multiple approaches to understanding, communicating, and resolving complex human-induced ecological and economic problems. Narayan's indigenous culture gives him immense knowledge for saving the global environment for the benefit of people and biodiversity. And so we're going to have the speakers in that order this evening. And then what I'd like to do is save questions for all 3 speakers until the end. And then we can pass the mic between our speakers so that they can potentially, multiple people can answer the same question. So we're going to start it off with Dan. Thank you to our speakers this evening.
Thank you, Kara. I've been working with wolves for about 20 years. I first started my, wolf research work working up in northern Minnesota, trapping wolves and radio collaring them and tracking them. From there, I worked down in the southwestern U.S. on the Mexican wolf reintroduction, and then moved back to Minnesota in the current position I'm in to implement the state wolf management plan in 2007, when wolves first came off the endangered species list. And all these positions that I've had, it's pretty evident that there's periods of time where wolves have conflicts with people, and it's primarily with livestock. But wildlife conflict can go both ways. We also try to identify what the needs of those species are and try to make sure that things in the environment are also favorable for those species. So, for example, with the wolves, they were persecuted throughout most of North America for the early part of the 19th and 20th century, and we pretty much eliminated them from most of the continent. However, there are some places where they held on. But this was done because of people's beliefs or thoughts that those conflicts with wolves impacted how many deer or elk or other ungulate species, there might be out there on the landscape for them to hunt. There might be conflicts with them trying to raise livestock. And so really, there was a campaign to try to eliminate wolves throughout most of North America. With the modern environmental movement, people started to recognize that these species were important on the landscape, and we wanted to try to preserve them and protect them. And at the time that wolves were listed under the Endangered Species Act, the only place in the lower 48 states where they occurred was in northern Minnesota and out on Isle Royal in Lake Superior. At the time, there may have been 300 to 500 wolves in northern Minnesota. Or I'm sorry, about 700 to 1,000 wolves in northern Minnesota at that time. And through a recovery planning process, they identified how many wolves should be restored to an area, and that species would be considered recovered under the Endangered Species Act, and what protections should be in place to try to get that population back to a point where its population is assured to survive well into the future. And kind of the third period in wolf history, in at least North America or Minnesota specifically, I consider kind of a protection or conservation phase. And this is kind of planning for the future. Minnesota went through this process back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, trying to identify long-term, when wolves come off the endangered species list, how would they be managed, and what would be put in place to assure that wolves would continue to thrive here. There's been several proposals under the Endangered Species Act to remove protections for wolves in the Great Lakes region, and a lot of those have been challenged, litigated against, and so the current status of wolves is that they still remain threatened under the Endangered Species Act in Minnesota, and most of the surrounding states have fully endangered under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Prior to the late 1970s, we had wolf population estimates that were pretty subjective. They were based on trappers' records or observations that conservation officers or wildlife managers had in the northern part of the state. But probably at its lowest point, somewhere between 350 and 700 wolves. Some of the things that caused the decline in wolves were eliminated at that point. There was no longer a bounty. That bounty was removed in about 1963. You could no longer aerial hunt wolves or shoot them from an airplane, and poisoning was not allowed. So after some of these things were removed, the wolf population started to recover and started to expand in number and distribution in the state. And by the time that they were listed under the Endangered Species Act, we probably had somewhere near 1,000 wolves. In the late 1970s, the DNR adopted a more objective way to estimate wolf numbers, and since that time it's been fairly consistent methodology in trying to estimate wolf numbers throughout the state. Early on it was done every 10 years, and then done every 5, and since 2012 we've been doing a population estimate every winter. Currently, or last winter of 2016-17, we estimated that there were 2,856 wolves in the state of Minnesota. As the wolf population increased, these blue dots are the wolf population estimates through time going back to the late 1970s. This red dashed line are the total complaints that were verified, and what I mean by that are these are complaints that involve livestock, that a conservation officer or a federal wildlife services agent goes out and investigates whether or not wolves killed livestock. And they base their investigation on characteristics of those kills, or how those animals were killed. They look for bite marks, they look for evidence that that wolf or that carcass was alive before it was fed on. So they're looking for hemorrhaging or subcutaneous hemorrhaging, where there's bruising underneath the skin tissue to show that the blood was pumping when that animal was bit. They're looking for tracks and sign of wolves in the area. They're basically looking for evidence to support that wolves killed the livestock. So through time, Generally, the number of complaints increased as the wolf population increased, and the number of farms, this green line, is fairly consistent with that same trend. The reason that the number of farms or locations where these events occur are less than how many animals are killed is because sometimes those farms have multiple animals killed in a year. The wolf population was isolated to northern Minnesota in the late 1970s. This is the red shaded area. And when that first population estimate was done in 1978, it was about 1,250 wolves. By 1989, the wolf population had expanded to include this blue shaded area and about 1,500 to 1,700 wolves. By 1998, that population expanded further to include this green shaded area and about 2,500 wolves. And there hasn't been much change in the distribution of wolves since the late 1990s, although there's a few places, this yellow shaded area in our last survey that we estimated wolf range. There were a few places where wolves had established in new places that they weren't in previous population surveys. And the locations of where these wolf livestock complaints occur are pretty consistent with where our wolf range is. You see more of them to the outer edge of that range, and it's also consistent with kind of the forest-ag transition line in the state of Minnesota. So as you get further south and west from the forested part of the state, you may encounter more livestock, more people, and expect to see more conflicts. But all these green dots are individual locations where there was a verified livestock complaint. The red dots, these would be where a wolf killed or attacked a dog. There's some dogs that are killed each year. Most of these occur near a residence or family pet. And then there's also occasionally some incidents that are considered human safety issues. So, for example, we had a wolf that was approaching snowmobiles and wouldn't move off the trail as snowmobiles were driving on this trail near Voyageurs National Park. Other incidents that wolves just don't exhibit, I guess, a behavior where they respond to people in a negative manner. They don't leave an area or a residence. And so the federal agents that investigate these determine that there's a potential human safety concern and trap those wolves. Most of the livestock complaints are of cattle, about 80% of those. This is pretty typical each year, but for 2017 we had 80% of the complaints were cattle. 7% were dogs, 5% sheep, 5% were other, and these could include goats, chickens, turkeys, and then 3% human safety. And the time of these complaints typically occur in the summer months, and that's when most livestock are out on pasture. They're in more remote pastures away from human activity. There's also calves, which tend to be more often killed by wolves than adult cattle. And so we kind of see a spike of these incidents in May, and then again in July and August. And I think some of this spike occurs right before fawns are born. So when we have fawns, young fawns out on the landscape in late May and early June, wolves have another source that they may not be looking at livestock as closely during that period of time. In the winter months, the reason that there aren't as many conflicts with livestock is because they're typically contained in smaller pastures. They're fed hay. They're not out on pastures, so they're typically not going to be ranging as far away from human activity. They're easier to check on. Of all the complaints that are received, about half of those are verified, and usually that's because there there's not enough information to verify the complaint. So either the animal was killed by something else, there's not enough evidence left, maybe there's not enough remains, but wolf tracks are present. And so somebody might call and report or have a complaint. On average, about 90 to 100 complaints occur each year. And in response to those complaints, about 200 wolves are trapped and killed each year at those locations. Most often, the livestock that are killed by wolves are calves. And in a typical year, there might be 70 to 80 calves killed. Since 1979, there's been a compensation program in place that the Minnesota Department of Agriculture administers. And so where there's verified losses from wolves, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture pays livestock producers for those losses. And so where they're verified by an investigator and they find evidence of wolf predation, those claims are reimbursed. And starting in 2001, previous to 2001, those claims were paid at about half the market value, and then in 2001 that was raised to full market value. So through time, we averaged, prior to that, about $50,000 a year in claims. Following that, it's been closer to $100,000 a year. And for since 2010, there's been about 114 claims verified each year and about $150,000 paid to livestock producers. So one solution to this is, we can create vegetarians out of predators, right? Probably not going to work. But there's other ways to mitigate livestock losses, and some people have taken these approaches. They include guard animals. Guard animals seem to be pretty effective with raising sheep, primarily, or I should say guard dogs. But in Minnesota, some producers are now using donkeys in their pastures with their cattle. Donkeys seem to be pretty aggressive towards canines and seem to be a deterrent when a wolf might come into a pasture. Although we've also had incidents where a donkey has been killed by wolves. So, it may not be 100% effective, but could help. Fencing can help. There's certain fencing strategies that can be utilized to fence out predators. These tend to be pretty expensive. They involve a lot of maintenance. But in some places, like the program that I worked on in the Southwest, where we're trying to reintroduce a small population of wolves to an area, conflicts early on can be really difficult and challenging for people that aren't very welcoming of having wolves out on the landscape. So we implemented these fencing strategies where we'd string out what's called flattery. And essentially, this was an approach that they used in Poland to hunt wolves, where they strung a fence out through a wooded area that has flagging hung every foot or so, and it kind of acts as a barrier for wolves. So as wolves approach this fence line, they won't cross it. And so you can string this out and try to push wolves into an area where they could be killed. Well, the reverse would be used to prevent livestock, where you put this around the livestock, and it tends to be a barrier around the wolf, or around the pasture, and the wolves will test it, but may not cross. And it's been effective for periods up to like 60 days where it's been tested and documented to keep wolves out. But it's also pretty labor intensive. There's certain lights that can be used. Each spring, the office that responds to a lot of these complaints in Grand Rapids, they distribute kind of highway flashing road lights, and livestock producers will put these in their pastures where they're having young calves, and it's just kind of a disturbance in that pasture, and they think that it helps deter wolves from coming into those pastures. Certain husbandry strategies can be helpful. You want to maintain a healthy herd, perhaps monitoring that herd frequently enough, and especially when they have young calves, to try to detect early on when there may be wolf activity there and be able to move those cattle to a different pasture or be able to confine them to an area that might be more protected. And then range riders. This is another program where just human activity might be a pretty effective deterrent. So you're out there frequently going out, checking on cattle, riding or driving the boundary of the pasture, and causing enough disturbance that it may not be a very inviting situation for a wolf. So there's a number of different things that are available to people. Some people implement these and utilize them more, but it often comes down to kind of a cost benefit to them. You know, and they may not have a lot of wolf issues that occur all the time, and so implementing these may not, you know, be very cost effective to raising their livestock. A very important relationship with wolves in Minnesota is the relationship with white-tailed deer. And this also has an impact on livestock depredation. And through time, first of all, we've already talked about our wolf population estimates, and those are charted here. Another thing that's done on an annual basis is an estimate of deer density in the northern part of the state, in the forested part of the state where most of the wolves occur. And then also, so that's this red line which I've plotted here. And then the blue line is the depredation take, or the number of wolves taken each year. And so if you look at this relationship where when deer density declines, we kind of see a spike in wolf depredation. As the deer density increases, we see a decrease in those depredation or number of wolves taken at those locations. And then as deer decline again, we see another increase. And more recently, maybe some little irregularity there with deer numbers dropping and then starting to increase. And so our wolf depredation take is kind of irregular. But you can, over time, you can see this trend. And I think part of this is related to winter severity. When deer are stressed and deer are in poor condition, they're more accessible to wolves for predation. And because of that, when we have more deer and we have deer that are or when we have deer that are in poor condition, we're going to have less predation on livestock. And then the inverse is true when deer numbers are down, and we tend to see more livestock complaints. So over time, this has held up pretty well, and into the future, it's just something we need to kind of keep track of. Another relationship between wolves and their prey, so based on a study in North America, if you plot prey density or ungulate biomass against wolf density, there's a pretty strong relationship. As prey density increases, wolf density increases. This is based on a study throughout North America, all different types of prey, and there's a pretty strong relationship to that. So looking again at our wolf population estimate over time, part of the reason why we had increases in wolf numbers and declines in wolf numbers and some instability here in wolf numbers over the last decade is changes in deer density. If you, again, plot our territory size, this line, or these dots, are the average pack territory size. So 1997, that estimate was about 200 square kilometers, about 150 square kilometers, and then back up higher in more recent years. And so, you know, if we kind of plot this line through territory size, it's kind of an inverse relationship with deer density. So again, as deer density increases, territory size gets smaller, wolves don't have to travel as far to find prey. As deer density declines, those territories tend to get larger again because they got to travel farther to find their prey. Okay, so again, another example of the relationship between wolves and white-tailed deer. And then finally, looking at wolves and these deer density estimates. So the diamond-shaped points here are wolf population estimates from the last 5 years, and those deer density estimates here. It's a pretty similar response to those relationships. As the deer numbers start to increase, we also start to see wolf numbers increase. And so there's another strong relationship there, which can result in another conflict, is what I'm trying to get at here. So we often hear about, if I'm a hunter, I want to have more opportunity to take a deer out there, and also at the same time, I don't necessarily want to see wolves out there in the area that I hunt. And so we maybe can't have both. You can't also have increasing deer numbers and not have wolves out there, because wolves are going to be out there looking for the same thing that the hunters are, and they're going to be in the places where deer populations are doing well. I advocate we can have both. It's been going on for several decades. We had some of the highest deer harvests in recent years when we had the highest wolf population estimates that we've had. So we're going to wrap up here with a couple of slides. And again, just kind of looking at our wolf population estimate through time. We had a wolf population that was rapidly expanding in both number and distribution in the state. But over the last couple of decades, from the late 1990s till now, we've had higher estimates of 3,000. We've had some estimates from 2,200 to about 2,400, and more recently about 2,800. And so our wolf population isn't necessarily driven by what kind of management actions are going on. It's mostly driven by what the prey availability is out there. And in the future, it's going to be similar as well. In regards to the Endangered Species Act, the efforts that have been made to reintroduce wolves and recover wolves in different regions have been pretty successful. And when I started my job, I was hired to implement the wolf management plan for the state because of wolves coming off the endangered species list. And so that first occurred in 2007, and at the time, wolves were removed because of this core population that originated in northern Minnesota of about maybe 700 wolves, expanded into Wisconsin and Michigan, and is now somewhere around 4,000 wolves, 4,000 to maybe even 5,000 wolves total. They reintroduced wolves in Idaho and Montana, and now we have wolves in Washington, Oregon, and even California, and the Southwest. They're still trying to reintroduce wolves down there. So these populations are doing well. Originally, the goal for wolf recovery in under the recovery plan for Minnesota and the other Great Lakes states was to have at least 1,250 to 1,400 wolves in Minnesota, and at least 100 wolves in another place, likely Wisconsin or Michigan. And so we've been well above that for a couple of decades now. And what the conflict is some of the, I guess, ambiguity of the Endangered Species Act. There's been 3 attempts to remove endangered species protections for wolves in the Great Lakes region, and 3 times they've been challenged, they've been litigated, and essentially it's when the wolf was listed under the Endangered Species Act, the core issue in these complaints that was supported was that they were listed throughout the lower 48 states as endangered, and the approach that the Fish and Wildlife Service is taking is kind of carving out this region and saying that these wolves no longer need protection here, and they're not really addressing everything else out here. So, biologically, wolves have met the recovery objectives here in Minnesota, but unfortunately, I think it's kind of overshadowed by what does everybody else expect and everywhere else that maybe wolves could be where they haven't been recovered. And so we're kind of at in a little bit of a legal limbo going back and forth with the Endangered Species Act and the legal protections for wolves until somebody resolves this. That's all I got. I guess we'll just transition right to Bill. Thank you.
All right, yeah, as Tara mentioned, my name is Bill Seyfried. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Minnesota now. My current research looks at winter habitat use of deer and also some moose ecology. But earlier in my career, I studied prairie dogs and black-footed ferrets in eastern Montana. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So prairie dogs are, how many here have seen the prairie dog exhibit here at the zoo? All right, so everyone knows about what they look like, how big they are. They're about the size of a big guinea pig. They're named prairie dog because they make that barking noise. Some people thought they sounded like a dog. The genus from their scientific name is Cynomys. And the cyno part of that means dog, and the mys part means mouse-like. So it's a kind of a dog-like mouse. They are rodents, and they are fossorial. Fossorial means that they burrow and live underground for most of their lives. So it's their burrowing activity that really can cause a lot of conflict with humans, but also makes them a really integral part of the ecosystem. So throughout North America, there are 5 species of prairie dogs. The widest ranging, in the darkest color on the map, is the black-tailed prairie dog. And you see they range all the way from Canada down to Mexico. The Mexican prairie dog is this kind of smaller, distinct population down here in Mexico. The white-tailed prairie dog occurs here, with some overlap with black-tailed. Gunnison's prairie dog is through here in the Four Corners region. And then another fairly geographically restricted population is the Utah prairie dog. So the geographic range of all 5 species pretty much coincides with the short grass and mid-grass prairies of North America. This is a picture of a Utah prairie dog, and that is one of the protected species. Under the IUCN Red List, the Utah prairie dog is listed as endangered, and the Endangered Species Act, it is threatened. Similarly, the Mexican prairie dog is endangered under IUCN. However, all 5 species of prairie dogs are showing declines in their population. It's estimated that only about 2% of prairie dog habitat is currently occupied by prairie dogs. So when you talk about prairie dog habitat, this is pretty much what it looks like. Eastern Montana does not look like western Montana. There are no Rocky Mountains in the eastern part of the state. This is the big sky country. Everything is very flat, everything is very open, and the prairie dogs really like that. They like to be able to see predators that are coming. That's one of the reasons they don't exist in the tall grass prairie like we have here in Minnesota. Prairie dogs form these very characteristic colonies that are called towns. Prairie dog towns they can occupy very large pieces of land, and within each town there are family groups that are called coteries. And you can see here, this is probably a family group that is on right outside of its burrow. So that mound they're standing on is giving them a good vantage point so they can see oncoming predators and then call out if they see a predator coming. So when people are walking around in prairie dog towns, they're constantly barking. And what I think it sounds like a dog chew toy. So it gets to be very annoying when you're out there all day. So that's their alarm call to tell their family members, tell their town mates that there's a predator nearby. This is another behavior they exhibit. This is the all clear sign. So if one of them does this thing where they throw their arms in the air and make a call that I'm not going to try to replicate, that gives their families and their neighbors the all clear sign. So the danger has passed. It's okay to go about foraging again. And if you're a human and you walk into a prairie dog town, eventually they will do this, because if you stop moving, they'll think you're no longer a threat. So it's pretty cute. So prairie dogs have been called a keystone species. So that means that prairie dogs have kind of a disproportionate effect on the ecosystem around them. They do this through several ways. One of the ways is that they are a prey base for a lot of other animals. And I'll get into the predators of prairie dogs coming up. In another way, they really alter the vegetation by clipping grass to eat it and to reduce the cover so they can have good lines of sight. And through their clipping activities, through their foraging activities, they actually increase the forage quality, or the plant quality, on their towns. Their digging activities really helps cycle the soil and aerate the soil. And they make kind of a really patchy habitat out in the prairie landscape. And this is beneficial to a host of other species, a lot of them that are themselves endangered. So here in this diagram, we have a picture of a black-footed ferret, a very extremely critically endangered species that relies almost exclusively on prairie dogs for its diet. In addition, you have a host of other things that eat prairie dogs. Excuse me. Some people call prairie dog towns the grocery store of the prairie. You can see here, this is a rattlesnake, a golden eagle, another black-footed ferret, a coyote, and then here's a badger. So some of the animals require speed and stealth to catch prairie dogs. Some are able to go down into the burrows and get them, like the snake and the black-footed ferret. And then there are things like the badgers that can dig them out. I'll relate a story of when I was working on ferrets and prairie dogs. We would live trap the prairie dogs in kind of tomahawk traps that I'll show you a picture of coming up. And it was the end of our trapping session, and we needed to collect all the traps off the prairie dog town. Well, we walked up to one trap, and there was a big rattlesnake coiled up, guarding that trap. And so we just decided to give the snake some space, go collect the rest of the traps, come back at the end and see if we could collect that trap. So we came back, the rattlesnake was still there, didn't want to move, so we kind of gently shooed it away, and as the rattlesnake uncoiled and slithered away, it had a big prairie dog-sized lump in it. So that snake was digesting and wasn't interested in getting out of our way, but it eventually did. All right, in addition to kind of benefiting other species, prairie dogs also provision ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are kind of things that help humans that they just do naturally. So some of these examples are water infiltration, soil erosion, soil productivity, soil carbon storage, and forage biomass. So this study compared 3 different types of prairies, one with prairie dogs present, a grassland without prairie dogs, and then areas that had been taken over by woody encroachment of other species. I think mesquite were the woodies that were growing here. And you can see from this graph that lands with prairie dogs had much more of these ecosystem services that were happening than compared to areas without prairie dogs. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that they increase forage biomass on the prairie dog towns. So prairie dogs have a history of persecution, just like wolves. Early in kind of European settlement of the West, mass numbers of prairie dogs were killed. The thinking was that prairie dogs competed with cattle for forage. So this resulted in a lot of conflict with humans. So there were mass campaigns to rid prairie dogs through poisoning, through shooting. They would flood the burrows, they would pour gasoline down the burrows and light them on fire. They would pump smoke into the burrows. Lots of different ways. People got pretty creative. So that's why only about 2% of the historic range is currently occupied. And then currently, there are still campaigns to kind of rid prairie dogs. A lot of varmint hunting is a very big industry in the West. There are outfitters that are set up to take people to prairie dog towns, and they basically bring high-powered rifles and very powerful scopes, and they'll have competitions to see who can shoot a prairie dog from the farthest distance or the number of prairie dogs that are taken in a day. Another issue that currently affects prairie dogs is the sylvatic plague. That's another name for the bubonic plague, the same plague that decimated Europe back in the Middle Ages. So plague was introduced to North America. It's believed to be around the year 1900 in San Francisco Harbor. Through a ship that came from Asia, there was likely an infected rat that introduced plague there. Since then, it's steadily moved its way eastward across North America. Prairie dogs are very susceptible to plague. When plague can get into a prairie dog town, it can kill up to 99% of the animals in that town. So part of the research that I was a part of when I was in Montana was to see how plague could potentially be reduced in prairie dog towns. Plague is transmitted by fleas that live on prairie dogs. So some prairie dog towns were dusted with a flea-killing insecticide. And it was our job to go out and trap prairie dogs and then comb them to see if the fleas if they still had fleas or not, pretty much. So you can see here are some of my coworkers that are working on setting up some prairie dog traps. Here's one of the traps that we held them in. And when we trapped them, we put in ear tags, and then we anesthetized them, so knocked them out, and then combed them for fleas. And that, believe it or not, that's me back in 2006. And we found that the dusting did keep flea numbers down and helped with prairie dog survival. As I mentioned, there's not a lot of trees, it's a lot of open space out there, and you can see we were making the most of the shade that we could. There was about a 2-week period where it was about over 100 degrees every day. Another reason that prairie dogs are currently declining is with nuisance removals. So there's a lot of industries that have popped up across the West to remove prairie dogs if they're deemed a nuisance on someone's ranch or private property. And there's a lot of different ways that they can be removed. Like they can be trapped and relocated. They can be poisoned or killed. They can use exclusion methods like fencing to try to keep prairie dogs out of areas. One of the more creative methods I saw online when I was looking up this part was a very high-powered vacuum that's used to put down into the prairie dog burrow and suck the prairie dogs out and put them into a holding tank and move them to a new area. So there's a lot of misconceptions around prairie dogs. As I mentioned, they do provide a lot of benefits to the ecosystem, to forage. And another thing that I forgot to mention was that because they increase the quality and the quantity of forage on their prairie dog towns, that cattle, bison, mule deer, and pronghorn have all been shown to preferentially graze on prairie dog towns rather than off prairie dog towns. So they really are kind of a good thing for even cattle. There are some myths out there, like I mentioned, the competition with cattle for forage. They will eat the same things, but studies have shown that when cattle are stocked at an appropriate or sustainable level on the landscape, that they don't outcompete either one. So they can coexist. And then there are some rural legends that seem to kind of persist. How many people have heard the story of someone's cow breaking a leg in a prairie dog hole? Yeah. And so I've talked to people that have tried to find verified accounts of this, and what they said is that they went to a ranch and said, I heard that you had a cow break its leg in a prairie dog hole. Can you tell me what happened? And they said, oh no, that was my neighbor. Go talk to them. So they go to the neighbor. They say, I hear this happened to you. And they say, no, that was my cousin. So they would go talk to the cousin. And they tried doing this many different times and always came out with a cold trail. A similar thing happened to me. My brother-in-law lives in Colorado, and his family have a bison ranch. And he told me that his parents have had bison break their legs in prairie dog holes. And I said, oh, okay. Can you tell me when that happened? He said, well, it hasn't been for a few years. Let me call him. So he called up his parents, and they said, oh no, it wasn't us. It was our neighbors. I said, okay. But I think that's kind of okay. There was one verified account I could find of someone that was riding a horse, and their horse stepped into a prairie dog hole, and they were thrown from their horse. So I'm not saying that it can't happen, but I don't think it happens to the extent that is kind of in the public imagination. And another one of the benefits they have is that prairie dogs provide food for this cute little guy. This is a burrowing owl, and a burrowing owl is another species that's very dependent on prairie dogs. Burrowing owls live underground, or they nest underground, and so they're one of the many species that really depend on prairie dog burrows. In addition to burrowing owls, there are rattlesnakes, amphibians, different rabbit species that all use prairie dog burrows to as part of their life cycle. So there are municipalities and around the West that have prairie dog coexistence plans in place, where they have some wildlands that they say prairie dogs can exist here, but they have stipulations where if prairie dog burrows get too close to private property, they'll try to set up some exclusion fences. Or if plague is documented in the prairie dog town, the town will be kind of culled, and then prairie dogs could then be translocated and moved in to repopulate. So I think that if some of the myths and misconceptions are kind of dealt with more, I think that coexistence with prairie dogs is possible. I know that sometimes their burrowing activities do cause damage, and prairie dogs do need to be removed from certain areas. But I think that if some of the misconceptions and benefits that prairie dogs have to the ecosystem could be more spread and more people were educated about them, I think that coexistence could be possible. And we had a lot of cattle out when we were trying to trap prairie dogs that would come through and trample our traps and, and things like that. So and we found that they were coexisting just fine.
Thank you, Tara, for your introduction. I will take you to Nepal for some time, from Minnesota. Since 2003 to 1992 to 2003, I was involved in one of the conservation organizations where I used to work with the local community and work with the people, work with the conserving tiger and conserving wildlife. So my talk would be basically along that line, and then I would also share some of the. Can I ask, how many of you have traveled Nepal or India or any other Asian countries? Okay. How many of you have seen tiger in the wild? Okay. It will be interesting, let me share some of my experience. I have seen tiger in the wild 4 times, so I don't want to take explaining all of them. I will just spot a couple of them. And one incident was pretty scary and interesting because we were traveling on a jeep and there were other tourists and even villagers. They were celebrating some festival and it was a 2-way traffic in the middle of the jungle in the Keystone National Park. And there were jeep with full of people coming this side and jeep full of people coming from that side. So suddenly one moment a male tiger just crossed between that heavy traffic and we just paused there, everybody stopped, keep quiet, and then tiger crossed that road, haven't looked to us, anyone, he just went to his own way, and then after 300 meter, and he just looked back, all of us. And then we thought that the tiger may be saying, okay, you can go now. And that was one moment I never forget. And, so it's always good to work in a forest situation. Sometimes that kind of opportunity happens. So my talk would be based mainly on, I'll talk a little bit of Nepal and how is the human-tiger conflict there, and how conservation effort we used to do there, and then I will also talk a little bit of climate change and how we have to adapt with the climate change. Nepal is a small country. The area is just the size of Tennessee here. If you compare the area of state of Tennessee, that is the land area of Nepal. But it is diverse, and about 30 million people live there, and there are several physiographic zones. Like we have a high mountain, highest peak in the world, Mount Everest. It is more than 8,000 meter high. And we have middle hill, and we have lowland. So all this diversity is sometimes within 200 kilometers of distance. So that means within 200 kilometers you have a highest peak in the world, and we have just 200 meters above the sea level. So you can imagine the diversity there. So as a result of that, we have 118 ecosystems, 181 mammals, 844 birds, 100 reptiles, and several amphibians, 43 amphibians, 185 freshwater fishes, and 160 species of flowering plant, and ranked 10th richest flowering plant in diversity Asia, and highest density of endangered tiger, and second highest density of rhinoceros. Asiatic rhinoceros. Before 1950, as other areas of the world, most of the land of Nepal was forested, full of forest, and only 20,500 indigenous people were living around the area in one of the national park where I used to work, Keystone National Park. And 3 large hunts between 1900 and 1970 was taken place, because when they were colonial India, a lot of people from the ruling regime used to go for hunting in Nepal. So in 1940, 120 tiger killed in one hunting season. So you can imagine the diversity that based on that hunting statistics in those days. And the Nepalese ruler used to serve whoever coming for the hunting, and then these are the number of tigers, and their skin were just as a trophy they display. So total across the Tarai and between 1933 to 1939, there were 423 total tiger were killed in the hunting seasons. When that was going on, and Nepal decided to start a protected area, start its conservation effort and allocating protected areas. So almost 20% of the land area is covered as a protected area. So a country poorest in the world and very low economic status, and putting effort in conserving those 20% of land is very difficult. So there are ecological constraints, like as the number of people increase, that they overlap the habitat, wildlife habitat, and conflict is always inevitable. And specifically for the tiger is a territorial animal. It defines its territory, like one male tiger defined its territory like 20 square kilometer in a range. So if there is another male tiger comes, it means one day. So they fight so strong, so fatal, and one of the tiger literally died in a fight between two dominant male. And the male hominins overlap with female, and male-female ratio is just 1:8. And so there is a frequent inbreeding problem of tiger, because there is a few male for a lot of female. And average reproductive life of a male was only 2.8 years, so there is mortality is also high. And very few offspring are fluctuating in survival rate. So that this is the statistics that James David Smith did his study in 2010. So let me talk about human-tiger conflict. The poaching is one of the biggest problems for reducing tiger number. So there are people doubt that even in our lifetime whether tiger would survive or not. So the Nepal being a small country, and then the heavy demand of tiger product in China, so we keep losing a lot of tiger there. And poaching is one of the problem, and the difficulty for detecting poaching is that what poachers do is they kill tiger and they bury the carcasses inside the forest. So you never know. Some people go inside the forest, they hide the gun in a tree trunk, and then they come back. Nobody knows what they did, but later when some tiger skin or tiger bone captured in nearby border site, and then they realize, okay, tiger have been poached there. So it's a little bit crucial that how to measure how much poaching or whether poaching is there or not. But there is a way that scientists and management determine that looking at the tiger sighting. And another is poisoning, like when female tiger with a cub, she becomes a little bit away from the core area just to save her cub from the male tiger. So at that time she has to kill livestock, And that is one of the reason of conflict, and people put poison in them. So that whole mother and cow get killed. There is another situation that that happens in the community, in the tiger range areas. And again, the livestock depredation, like tiger kill livestock, and people cannot, there are some compensation package, but still that is not sufficient. And poachers get advantage of that, and they just instigate community and say, okay, your tiger, your animal has killed, and let's put poison there. So that was also the problem. And man-eating tiger, like human life is ultimate cost, and there are several incidents that tiger killing people. In one incident, when I was working in Nepal, one of the forest guard who was guarding that his community forest so that people don't come to steal wood and some trees. What happened in the evening that he was sleeping, half asleep, and tiger pulled his leg, and he cried out loud that something happens, it's a flight or fight situation, and fortunately tiger ran away. So that kind of close and proximity that people have to suffer for the tiger, and the man-eating is a big problem. And until 2014, there was, when tiger becomes a stray, when it becomes a little bit weaker in the wild to hunt of its own prey, and it maybe sometimes hunt for the animal, and situation becomes quite tense, and then authority has to deal with several problems, and then people have to get away with that situation, and sometimes tiger may be killed, sometimes tiger captured and transferred to the zoo. To minimize conflict, what we have done in that part of the world, community-based conservation in action, even though there are a lot of problems with the human and tiger, with the people, we managed to encourage local community to establish community forest. So we have been able to convince them that it's protecting, earlier it was protecting forest is national park, making national park, and they are reducing their grazing areas and then free-ranging areas, but later what we convinced them is it's not authority taking your forest, it is your forest. You can manage this and it will increase your habitat. So while we were doing that, we have been able to conserve like more than 6,000 hectares of highly degraded land. It was barren and degraded, and then with a community initiative, it became a community forest, and it became a connecting habitat from one place to another, and then tiger number has increased, rhino number has increased. In one incident that when we were getting support from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and then the expert from there was visiting in the project area, and I was communicating with the local community to conserve forest, and the person from here, she didn't believe that tiger number would increase with the community forest. She was telling that, okay, we'll provide funding and forest would increase, but I don't think tiger would come to that forest, crossing that river, crossing that road. And I was confident enough to tell her that I can bet you tiger definitely goes to that another community forest and make their habitat. And it became true. Like it was a discussion in 2002, and in 2008 when I visited my research study there, In fact, the tiger were moving across the road and then making their habitat there, and then also causing some problem also with the people and livestock. So the thing is, if you increase forest area and mitigate the problem, then tiger number can increase. But one of the things is how to deal with this human and tiger situation, conflict situation. I'll come to that point later. And as community forestry increased its habitat, economic incentive also came there. Like people started tourism in their community forest. As forest preserve and species number increased, rhino number increased, tiger number increased, and then they would also get some revenue. That revenue became a huge, like people can use that in several development and community support activities. So also we did ensure national and international funding to higher level management. So with this effort, like Nepal has committed to increase double tiger number in 2022, because it was in 10 years they have committed to double the number of tiger, and it is some evidence is showing there, but still you never know that how much tiger poached and how poaching is going on. So in 2013 it was 187 breeding individual tiger recorded. In 2010 there were 110 to 155 breeding individual were recorded, and total tiger density in Nepal forest is 6 per 1,000 kilometers. And I did my research in 2011, like it was, there was a village in the national park, and it was occupying the conflict was intense, because there was a village and then it's just right there in the tiger habitat, and there was a village. So always complaint of the people was man eating and livestock depredation, and people going to the forest, stealing some wood. So that conflict was going on, and we managed to resettle that community from outside the park. So my research was, for the people, we didn't force them to come out, but we convinced them that what is the better lifestyle, you going outside from this place or living here. And they choose that going outside would be better. And they voluntarily decided to move from that part to outside. So my research study was, does voluntary resettlement would increase for the people's conservation efforts. So I also wrote a book on that, Make a Home for Tiger. So resettlement, what does that happen is, in my result shows that people benefit due to access and resources. At the same time, biodiversity benefit increase in habitat. Like these people were living in this primitive situation, but now they have a full access of electricity, road, and market. And this is the settlement that after resettlement, that people were living in this town called Padampur, and then they don't even have to change their town's name. Whatever village they were living, they put the same name of the village, and this is the area they left. So all these area became for the tiger conservation. Almost we managed to occupy 16 square kilometer additional land that is totally for the tiger and rhinoceros. So when we were doing that, and as a Nepali, and then I did my research there, and I am right now living in the United States. So what I can do to save those tigers in that part of the landscape. So we all know that there is a climate change happening, and then all those Himalayan range, Mount Everest, and whole northern part of Nepal is full of Himalaya. And if those Himalayan ice melt down, then everything would be lost. So based on this climate change situation, what I have decided to change, number one, first my behavior, that how do I define my behavior living here, so that that would contribute to the conservation, tiger conservation back there. So these are the tiger photographed by camera trap while I was working there. All these tigers, and if we didn't manage to control or mitigate climate change, all these tigers would go down, all their habitat would be damaged. So this is the rhino, and then although the habitat would be lost. And even the people who have subsistence agriculture in the middle hill of Nepal, there is a very subsistence farming going on. They do by their farm, by their own hand. So again, that as a result of climate change is happened if that Mount Everest ice melt down, then everything is go down. I was in 2013. I was in Nepal, and then one of my friends was working in meteorology department. And 6 months ago, there was a flood, big flood, like one of the ice-bearing mountain, a fishtail mountain. All the ice became avalanche and flooded. 6 people died, and then my friend said, flooding is a regular incident, but this time it was chaos, extra chaos. And I asked, what does that mean? And he said, because they have a belief that their ancestor told them, until you see the ice in the tip of the mountain, you won't go for hunger. So if all the ice of this mountain go down, then there will be famine, there will be no food. So they were panicked with that belief system. And fortunately that mountain again recapped with ice, and then they were happy. Otherwise the problem was severe. So what next? That since I talked earlier that what are the conservation effort, community forestry, economic incentive, and people getting benefit from it. Only that is not sufficient. That we need to start thinking moral values. Like when I see a tiger, like it's not, oh, this tiger is beautiful, I like that. Not only to that, that how much I can contribute to save those species for the long term. So we need to generate that kind of value system, and then communicate with other people that how to generate value-based awareness. And for the country like Nepal, there are a lot of international funding agencies, conservation organizations who support their funding. And that is for some period, but that is not sustainable. So we also have to do some effort to develop local entrepreneurship, so people could earn by themselves and know the value, like this value of having a tiger and benefit of having tiger in the ecosystem. And that will help a long-term survival of this species. And whatever community forestry resource I was talking about, that really benefit is equal, they say, but it's not equitable. For example, for the poor people who has to depend on the forest for their living, and if we say equal, that other people may not have that requirement what that people have. So based on the economic criteria, we need to define that benefit. So I was one of the advocates that let's define user of the community forest as a economic status, so less ordinary people will get more out of the forest resources. So I still do advocate that kind of equitable distribution of resources and make best use of technology. Like these days, even in Nepal, everybody has cell phone. So whenever there is a conflict of tiger, if tiger are approaching to the village, there would be some kind of messaging mechanism could be developed and just alert people, hey, tiger is coming, you become careful and just tie up your livestock and don't go outside, there is a danger. So if we can communicate use of technology to inform, that would also help community to minimize conflict. And another thing is like, what is the story and religious values of tiger? This is one of the Hindu god, woman god riding on a tiger that indicate that significance of tiger, and then this generate values among the community who are living in that area. And there was Buddhist view of tiger as well. In one of the temple in Nepal, it called Namo Buddha. Buddha in his past life gave his flesh to tiger because tiger came with a cub, and she said to Buddha, like, my cubs are hungry and they need to feed. And what Buddha did, and he did give his flesh to fulfill that hungry tiger cub. And in next life, all four tiger cub became his disciples. So that is stated in one of the scripture. And there is a temple, in fact, in Nepal, Namo Buddha temple, where you can see all those tiger cub and Buddha's statue. And I'm also involved in Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light. I am a board member there. And we are promoting leadership program, movement builder program, and empowering community to understand climate change problem, and then coming up with some solutions. So one of the initiatives we are doing is Just Solar. And this is the picture of Minneapolis mayor with one bishop and imam putting it together and promoting solar for the alternative energy resources to reduce pollution. And we also meet and congregate with different faith communities and increase their understanding towards climate change, and then how to mitigate challenges that coming up in the climate change. This is the end of my talk, and thank you very much for it.
Thank you so much to all three of our speakers this evening. Maybe you can join me up here and we can take some questions. So would somebody like to start? Yes.
I have a question to entertain all three. I heard that out west, the wolf population became very separated, and there was a lot of inbreeding, the population went down. So in the case of the tiger or our gray wolf, with such small territories, how much is inbreeding a problem? And with the declining population, I suppose we need to get worse.
Yeah, so the question is about inbreeding in wolf populations and how that impacts the population. Well, in Minnesota, we've looked at genetics in our wolf population, and really, from a genetic standpoint, there aren't any concerns. The population isn't inbred. We have a large number of wolves, and we have a connected population, you know, to Canada. So there's constant movement of wolves between here and further north. The populations out west have expanded in number and distribution. You know, historically it could have been an issue, but currently it's not. The place where it has been an issue is on Isle Royale, where there's only a couple wolves left that are inbred.
How about the tiger? Is that, I suppose the prairie dogs still.
But tiger, we have initiated landscape scale conservation, so there are some effort has been done to connect habitat for Nepal and India, and some habitat from India to Bangladesh. So this movement of tiger would minimize that inbreeding problem. I cannot say what exactly, how many tiger male coming there from crisscrossing from one area to another, but scientists says that there is some movement from Indian male coming to Nepal, and then that would minimize a little bit of that, but I cannot tell right now substantially that what is the status there. But some effort has been done.
Another question? Yes.
Can you give us a little update about the wolf population up by the boundary waters? That they are moving some back onto Isle Royale, or is that decided yet?
Well, that's not something that I'm involved with, so I don't really have any details. There was recently an announcement about a plan that they'd like to move forward and put 30 wolves on Isle Royale over several years, but as far as where they're going to come from, I don't think they've made any decisions on that. Wolves in Minnesota are doing well. We have you know, a thriving wolf population. On average, you know, there's about 5 wolves in a pack, and they cover about 50 square miles. And generally, if you drew a line from Hinckley to Little Falls and up to the northwestern corner of the state, everywhere north and east of that line is pretty well occupied with wolves.
Another? Up in the corner?
When livestock kills are investigated, how can you tell the difference between like a dog or a wolf who's done it?
It's mostly based on efficiency. Like a dog, if a dog kills livestock, it tends not to be very clean. It's not very precise. They might have more bite marks in a number of different places. When a wolf makes a kill, it's pretty efficient at it. You know, they'll make an attempt, and if they're not successful, they're not going to try to, you know, continue pursuit or injure themselves. For the most part, you know, they grab on, they bite, they cause a lot of damage, but it's, you know, it's kind of localized to a specific area. Whereas a dog, they might cause a lot of damage in a lot of different places and may not even feed on it because they can go home and eat. So that's mostly how it's determined. And you know, if there's tracks and some consistency in the area of the animal, they can make those determinations.
Yes.
So this is a rhetorical question for Bill. Could we loan some of the prairie dogs to the village tigers over there so that the villagers can get the sign? Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's a rhetorical question.
I have a question. What are are there any efforts for increasing the prairie dog population or reintroducing it to certain areas, since you mentioned that only 2% of the historical areas are populated currently?
So the question is, or was, are there any efforts to reintroduce prairie dogs to formerly occupied habitat? There is for the Utah prairie dog, where they're endangered, there are some programs that have been trying to restore prairie dogs. There are some private ranch lands, like owned by Ted Turner, where he's trying to increase prairie dog numbers and then also reintroduce black-footed ferrets. So there are some efforts being made, but generally there's a lot of pushback from basically cattle ranchers.
Take one or two more.
I don't think I understand when an animal is endangered versus threatened, what can the human action be in relation to that animal?
Okay, the question is, when an animal is endangered or threatened, what can the human reaction or action be? Like, in how to protect it, or how to...
Well, it sounded like Minnesota was preparing for when wolves came off of the endangered list or were downgraded. You were going to take some action at that point, but not before, and so I didn't know kind of what the lines were.
Yeah, so in regards to, I guess, generally in regards to wolf conservation, it's just kind of an ongoing thing. What we've been doing in Minnesota since wolves were put on the endangered species list was estimating how many wolves are out there and kind of minimizing the conflicts. And long term, there really isn't much difference with what we would do with wolves in the state. Specifically in other places where they're trying to restore wolf populations, they've actively reintroduced them, where they've brought wolves and released them into areas and tried to get those populations to recover. Specifically on like the classifications under the Endangered Species Act, there's endangered and threatened. There's two different legal statuses. And so if an animal is fully endangered, it's at risk of becoming extinct. There's evidence that the population is declining. There's some factor that's causing that decline. And so they're fully endangered. They're protected essentially from being killed for any reason. If they're threatened, they're at risk of becoming endangered. And so I guess the analogy is, endangered is like you're in the ICU, or you're getting, you need immediate attention, you're on life support. If you're threatened, you're kind of in the hospital, being observed, maybe getting some treatment, and the ultimate effort is to send you home and have you fully recovered, right? So as an animal progresses from endangered to threatened to recovered, it's to get them off the endangered species list.
We'll take one more question over here.
With black-footed ferrets, after they were trapped out of Meeteetse after the last ones and they contracted distemper, reintroduction of them, how successful has that been with the black-footed ferrets cycling with the prairie dog population specifically, primarily off the blacktails?
So the question was how are the black-footed ferret reintroductions doing? Mm-hmm. There's been about 10 or so reintroduction sites across the West. The success of those reintroductions really depends on the persistence of the prairie dog towns and the extent of the prairie dog town. So if there's a lot of prey, the black-footed ferrets do well. I mentioned that plague is kind of moving its way eastward. There are areas that haven't been affected by plague yet, where the black-footed ferret reintroductions are doing a lot better. When the prairie dogs die off due to plague, the ferrets also die off. So I was working in an area that had a pretty good amount of prairie dogs, but plague had gone through the area, and I think they had reintroduced 8 to 10 ferrets about 2 years before I got there, and when I was there were only 2 left. I think that reintroduction site has now been kind of abandoned, deemed a failure, but there are other sites now, and I think they've reintroduced ferrets, I think, in Canada now, and last I heard they were trying a site in Mexico as well.
Gunnison has been abandoned?
I'm not sure about the Gunnison work. That part I'm not really sure about.
Well, thank you so much to our 3 speakers this evening. Let's give them a nice round of applause.